Welcome to Future Squared, the podcast all about corporate innovation, entrepreneurship, and self-empowerment. Future Squared brings you a double dose of innovation inspiration every week to help you and your company stay relevant in an era of rapid change and 10x your results in both your professional and personal life. Each week, I'll bring you corporate innovators, entrepreneurs, authors, keynote speakers, and thought leaders such as Steve Blank, David Allen, Brad Feld, Tim Harford, Karen Dillon, Jenny Blake, Neil Patel, Rand Fishkin, Pascal Finette, Ryan Blair, and Ash Moria, to name just a few. While every Friday, I'll bring you Fast Fix Friday, some quick, digestible insights to help you end your week on a high as you head off for the weekend. Future Squared is brought to you by Collective Campus, an innovation hub, school and consultancy based in Melbourne, Australia and Singapore that works with companies to help them adopt the mindset, methods and tools to navigate change and survive and thrive in an era of rapid disruption. If your organization needs help coming up with ideas, testing and turning ideas into reality, incubating teams, driving cultural change, or connecting and partnering with startups, then visit www.collectivecamp.us. And without further ado, here's today's podcast.
Welcome back to Future Squared. I'm super excited to bring you today's guest, Jeremy Bailenson. Jeremy is founding director of Stanford University's Virtual Human Interaction Lab and faculty leader at Stanford Center for Longevity. He's earned a Ph.D. in cognitive psychology from Northwestern University, and he's the founder of Striver, a virtual reality organization that works with NFL teams and the German national football team to put them into real-world, real-game situations, not only to aid decision-making, but also to improve their confidence going into games. Bailenson studies the psychology of virtual reality and has been in the space of VR since 1999. In particular, he studies how virtual experiences lead to changes in perceptions of self and others. His lab builds and studies systems that allow people to meet in virtual space and explores the changes in the nature of social interaction. His most recent research focuses on how VR can transform education, environmental conservation, empathy, and health. He's just penned his second book, Experience on Demand: What Virtual Reality Is, How It Works, and What It Can Do. Expect to learn a number of things in this show, including what some of the applications for virtual reality are, including how it might be used to quell biases and reshape a person's worldview, what some of the risks and potential downsides might be, and as such, what virtual reality companies need to be thinking about when designing software or immersive experiences, and how far away are we from mainstream adoption. Learn that and lots more in today's conversation with the one and only Jeremy Bailenson.
Welcome to the show, Jeremy.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me, Steve.
No, it's an absolute pleasure to have you on the show. And we were just talking before I hit the red button that you've been on a bit of a virtual book tour and you just came straight from NPR studios over in San Francisco.
Yeah, I was in NPR. The paper copy of the Wall Street Journal reviewed it today and had some really nice things to say. So it's we're getting lots of action on all fronts of media. It's exciting.
Awesome, man. Loving it. Did you manage to take a break from the book tour to catch the game on Sunday?
I went media dark and enjoyed, other than the TV that is, and enjoyed the game. Had some friends over. It was nice.
Yeah, nice. Were you rooting for the Eagles or the Patriots?
Well, as you know, I work with a lot of NFL teams, and because I use VR to help NFL teams get better, I'm no longer to be able to be a fan of specific teams. So I was rooting for a good game.
Yeah, fair enough. I've never really, I don't know how to deal with that kind of an answer. Whenever I ask someone, who do you follow? They're like, I just like watching the game. It's like, come on, man, you got to pick a team. Don't be sitting on the fence.
Well, I bet on the length of the national anthem by Pink, and I bet on the over and lost.
That's awesome. How much did you put on that?
$5.
Oof. Well, hey, that was a lot of money a long time ago, so very bold bet. Anyway, Jeremy, let's get into today's conversation. I mean, you've been studying VR since 1999. Give us a quick overview of your work at Stanford's Virtual Human Interaction Lab.
So my PhD is in cognitive psychology, and in the late 1990s, I decided that, the work I was doing then, I was running experiments on humans to understand things like how do you form categories, how do you make decisions, how do you reason and do argumentation. And then after I'd run the studies, I would build mathematical models. We'd write computer programs to model what was going on in the mind. So kind of low-level AI. And what struck me around 98, 99 was two things. One is there was a lot of other people doing that at the time, and cognitive science was a very saturated field. And two is, frankly, a lot of those people were better at it than me. I mean, I really hadn't, it wasn't grabbing me in the way that, given I was working 80-hour weeks, it really wasn't my passion. So in 1999, I decided to switch fields, and I left cognitive science, and I took a postdoc, and a postdoc is between being a grad student and a professor. It's kind of this purgatory land. I learned how to build VR from a hardware standpoint and to program it from a content standpoint and do some 3D modeling to make the objects. And at the same time, ask bigger, more social questions, things less about how the brain works and more about what does learning mean in VR? Can you use it for training? How does it change communication? How can you measure engagement and communication? Kind of bigger, more social questions as opposed to cognitive ones.
Fantastic. And I guess this has led to the release of your second book, the follow-up to your first, which was Infinite Reality. And the new book, which we alluded to earlier, is Experience on Demand, what virtual reality is, how it works, and what it can do, which came out last week. So congratulations on the release of the book.
Thank you.
So it provides an in-depth look at VR, how it can be harnessed to improve our everyday lives. I mean, this includes honing our performance, recovering from trauma, improving learning, and enhancing our empathic and imaginative capabilities. And I mean, a big chunk of our audience, corporate innovators, early-stage entrepreneurs, so the whole concept of being more empathic insofar as your customers' needs are concerned and insofar as being more imaginative is concerned, is a very, very big deal. So I guess I wanted to take a step back and focus on the empathy side of things and some of the stuff you've been working on there, which, for example, the technology can transform your gender and race. So your research has shown this exercise in empathy can actually change the way people act towards others. So keen to explore that.
Yeah, so this journey begins in 2003, and the first corporate grant I ever got at Stanford was from a company called Cisco, and there was a woman there, her name was Marcia Satowski, a very brilliant executive, and she said, Jeremy, can you use VR to help people? Can we rethink the way we do diversity training? And so the way we tend to do diversity and tolerance training, you either read about case studies or maybe you do some role playing and you imagine what it's like to be someone who's different. What we built back in 2003 was the virtual mirror. And so picture this, you are moving around physically and you're wearing the helmet, the VR goggles, and in VR you see a mirror and you see your reflection in that mirror. And it takes about 3 or 4 minutes to induce what psychologists call body transfer. So for example, when you move your right arm physically, you see it move virtually. You look down and you see your arm move and you see it in the mirror. And so after about 4 minutes of moving around physically and seeing those movements mirrored synchronously, so at the same time, the brain tends to expand and include that image of the other into the schema of self. The next stage of the treatment is that we hit a button and we change it. You become older, or you become younger, or you become a different skin color. You go from male to female or female to male. We put you in a different type of a body. We then repeat the body transfer so you really feel like you're a different person. And then we network in a second person, and that person proceeds to treat you poorly based on your race or your gender or how old you are. And you experience trauma, you experience prejudice firsthand while wearing the body of someone else. You walk a mile in their shoes.
It reminds me of some of those experiments I've seen run in the past where people wear an actual physical bodysuit and then go out into society and see how people treat them. So this could be someone who's, normally say 6 foot, 150 pounds or something like that. And then they'll go out and they'll be say 300 pounds and the way people treat them is often different to what they're used to. But I guess doing this through VR means you can just scale that across all ages and help build more empathic individuals across the board rather than run these sort of harder to do experiments.
Yeah, and if you think about, if you're talking about doing diversity training and scaling it up, so at Stanford, it's required that I do every 18 months, I have to do about 2 hours of diversity training. And I don't want those whole 2 hours to be in VR. You don't need it. VR, for those listeners who have done it, it's a really intense experience. It feels like it's happening to you. And I don't think we need to have that entire 2 hours be in VR. I think you can go in for 5 minutes, feel what it's like to face discrimination, and then you can take the goggles off and go and read about case studies, and now you've got this emotional lightning bolt, you're more aroused, you're more motivated to pay attention, and then you proceed, and then you hop back in. So I think it's really important that we don't try to stick everything in VR. I think it's really great for these intense moments, and we can use that to augment and integrate into a typical training program.
Yeah, and I think that's something that I quite like about your book and about your approach to VR in general, is that it's not coming from this place of technotopia. You are looking at, say, the downsides, the risks, the challenges, and the fact that, hey, it is a super immersive experience. And sometimes, like you said, you might only need 5 minutes, 10, 20 minutes. Anything more than that may just be too much.
Yeah, yesterday I gave a talk at one of the large tech companies in the Valley that's building VR, and we won't name the company, but I had their entire VR team in a room, and I said, I'm begging you guys, let's imagine it's 5 years from now. What are the mistakes we want to avoid now? Let's pretend that it's 5 years from now, and we had a time machine. What would you do differently? And I went through all the things that I would do differently if I was designing VR. And then one of them, I'll just throw this out there. Can we make it so that virtual reality doesn't work in a moving car? Literally, from a hardware standpoint, it detects the car movement, and it can't work in a car. As we saw from Pokemon Go, there were people driving while playing this augmented reality game. I don't want people driving their cars wearing virtual reality helmets. Can we just nip that one in the bud from a hardware standpoint?
Yeah, and that's similar to, I think, the Tesla Model S. It can do almost anything except play video on its little tablet screen, which for obvious reasons, right? But I think that's a really fundamental issue you're trying to tackle there, because a lot of these companies that are building VR, I imagine the vast majority would be venture capital backed, and therefore they need to hit 18x internal rate of return after, say, 18x returns after, say, 5 to 7 years. And so they're just driven to try and hit these revenue targets. And we've seen that apply to companies like, say, Facebook. Obviously not a VR company as such. Obviously they acquired the Oculus Rift, but Facebook and a lot of these other organizations have just been driven to drive traffic to their site, capture people's attention, sell more ads, but at what cost? And we recently saw the likes of Sean Parker come out and say, look, Facebook is exploiting a vulnerability in human psychology to effectively sell more ads and increase their revenue. And I just, I just wonder what the implications of that are when you apply that to VR, when these companies are just, say, running and gunning to get people immersed in it.
Yeah, look, I've been criticized for being an optimist, and when the New York Times reviewed my book, they thought that I was, even though chapter 2, as you point out, is about the downsides, and I felt like in every chapter I'm pretty honest about these possible abuses. But so given that let's just throw that out there. My take for the big companies, and these are the companies, when you talk about Facebook or Samsung or Google or any of the big tech companies, they've got a revenue stream. And VR is not going to make or break that revenue stream. So my opinion here, and this is fairly informed because I talk to these companies at the highest levels, is, they want to do VR right. They don't want to create a generation of people walk around in goggles who can't speak to other people or who are doing these intensely abusive activities. My sense from talking is that they've learned in some ways from the things that have happened. And because the main revenue stream doesn't depend on this, they get to kind of take a step back a little bit. And Stephen, I realize I'm a little optimistic there, but that's the sense I get.
No, and that's fair enough. And I imagine you've been doing a lot of work with these companies at a high level. So your opinion would be much more informed than mine, but I hope that's the case. And you briefly touched there on distraction, and I know there was an incident in, I think it was the Moscow News, where somebody had been playing a VR game and then fell through a plate glass table and bled to death because they just kept playing the game. So
I read this report too, and I was so taken by what a tragic event this is. So that I wrote for Slate.com. I wrote the Bailenson here 8 rules how to stay safe in VR, and that's available free for anybody. Please go check that out, because it's it's tragic that this happened to the poor Russian gamer. On the other hand, every year in the United States, I'm sure in other countries as well, there are many deaths because people are driving while on their cell phone. So distraction in media is not a new thing, and it's what I can hope what we can do, what we didn't do with the smartphone, and it's too late now because the cultures have been fairly cemented. Is we didn't make it not okay. We should have done something more aggressively to make it so you can't kill other people while you're on your phone in a car. I want us to nip this in the bud in VR, and which is why I jump up and down and on stage and I talk about this. This is not a joke, guys. This is real serious stuff, and let's try to solve it.
Yeah, yeah. It's funny because I think with any new technology or innovation, people always point to some of the downsides up front, but completely ignore the downsides of the existing sort of technology. So in this case of VR versus, say, smartphones, where people are texting and driving, and there's incidents of that throughout history. I mean, you can go back to the introduction of you could look at the Tesla automobile and the first accident with the Tesla. Oh, everybody's up in arms, but how many human drivers have accidents? I think it's something like 50,000 a year in the United States, 50,000 fatalities rather. But people often overlook that, and you see that as well now with blockchain. People saying, "Oh, it's just such a power suck." But what about the power suck of all of the big banks around the world combined? There's always an alternative that people often forget to look at.
Agreed. I couldn't have said it better myself.
So, I guess on some of the other implications, I mean, we briefly touched on the social responsibility of these companies that are developing VR applications and hardware. And I mean, today we're touching our phones about 2,000 plus times a day. Some of the more extreme users out there touch their phones over 5,000 times a day, according to a recent study. Now, what are your thoughts on the addictive qualities of VR? Obviously, this is something that companies need to think about insofar as the design is concerned. But I mean, is this something that we could see people just putting their headsets on for hours on end because they're just so addicted to the dopamine hits or whatever else the case may be?
I'm a social scientist and I try to stick to the research that I know. So there hasn't been much academic research on addiction in VR. There simply hasn't. And to be honest, I don't think you're going to see a lot of academic research because nobody I know is going to want to stick someone in VR for 10 hours a day for 8 years straight, the same way that very few, tobacco researchers were going to randomly assign people to smoke 2 packs a day for 30 years, right? It's just, we know a priori it's a terrible way to spend your day in VR for 10 hours a day. So we're not going to study that. So I have no data, and let's just be clear about that. That being said, I can't talk to you honestly and say that I think VR is such a powerful experience that can change your behaviors and attitudes about race relations, and not claim that when you do the other stuff, it's going to be so compelling that we're going to want to do it a lot. So, what this is why, frankly, is one of the reasons I'm writing this book, and one of the reasons why we made the downsides chapter 2, which is I want people to understand what the pros and cons are. I talk about my lab has a 20-minute rule, which is that, VR is pretty good for 10 minutes, 20 minutes. It's about time to take it off, touch a wall, have a glass of water, talk to somebody. If you need to go back in, take a break. But to be honest, I haven't seen much VR content that needs more than 20 minutes.
Yeah. I know you said the same thing about field trips. And, there's been a lot of talk about, sending elementary school or primary school kids out to, say, I don't know, ancient Rome. Just put on your headset and head out there. But it doesn't necessarily need to replace field trips. And it is something that you can do for, say, 20 minutes at a time.
Yeah, field trips are awesome. I want them to stay. But what if you had a field trip every single day? Meaning the best part of whatever your great trip is, you went to the Great Barrier Reef, you went to Washington, D.C. to see all the monuments. You can just beam in there, get the experience, and go out. And again, I don't want it to replace the field trips, but we can only do a couple of those a year pragmatically. Wealthier schools get more of them. With digital stuff, it's free to copy and paste it, and the hardware is already cheap enough that you can put this in lots and lots of different places. So it's just, why shouldn't every lesson have a lab component to it? I mean, think about, an art history class where you're learning about sculpture. Why would anyone not want to see a sculpture in VR as opposed to a screenshot of it on a 2D screen? It doesn't make sense.
Yeah. And I can imagine, as a, say, 7 or 8 year old, if you're being beamed back to, say, I don't know, 1 million BC, and I don't know if that's the right time frame, but back to the time of the dinosaurs, rather than looking at these pictures in a book, like you said, in 2D or on your screen, you're actually there. And I imagine, and obviously there's no academic research on this, but that as a child, you would find that a lot more compelling, and it would arguably make you more likely to want to learn a lot more than you would if you just read about it in a book.
Yeah, when we think about the educational gains of VR, we think about first of all, we think about, is it better at learning transfers or higher efficacies? Do you actually learn better when you're in immersive VR compared to on a 2D screen? And, the answer to that one is fairly complicated. So for some things, the spatial aspect of it is critical, like being able to wander around and see things from different angles. That causes better learning and learning transfer. But that's not for everything. Some things are told better by a book or told better by chalkboard. And it's important to acknowledge that. On the motivation side, though, in terms of getting people fired up about learning, we've got fairly good data on that, and I can tell some fun anecdotes. At the 2016 Tribeca Film Festival, we had this is with adults now, not kids. We had basically a lesson on marine science and chemistry. It was about ocean acidification and how it's going to affect the makeup of coral reefs based on the lower pH of the oceans from human-produced carbon dioxide. And the Tribeca Film Festival, it's run by Jane Rosenthal. She's this brilliant forward thinker. She's got this VR arcade where there is for 7 or 8 days straight, there's an 11-hour window each day where people can come in and do VR. And at our booth, we had a line of, sometimes 100 adults deep waiting, for a long time to go into VR to learn about chemistry. And, I've never had anybody yell at me because the line was too long to read a textbook. It's there's just something about the magic of VR and just the aesthetic the experience that's so fun that people want to do it. And now maybe, Steve, that's part of that is the novelty, and that'll wear off. But, I've been doing VR for 20 years and the novelty hasn't worn off for me.
Yeah, and it's funny as you're saying that, I'm just thinking back to, say, primary school, and you've got some kid who's gone over to Thailand with his family, and he comes back, and for the 2 weeks thereafter, he just can't stop talking about Thailand and all the stuff he learned about the country, and everybody else is just like, all right, man, shut up about Thailand. But you could be sending this kid to Thailand, to Cambodia, to wherever else in the world on a daily basis, and they're going to get a much greater breadth of experience.
Indeed.
So on what you just said there around, you've been studying this for 20 years, and VR is kind of like AI in some cases, where people are always saying, oh, it's only a few years away, and you read some analyst reports around when we'll get to critical mass, mainstream appeal, immersive applications, and so on. Some people say 2 years, some people say 10 years. What are we looking at, Jeremy? What are your thoughts?
My thoughts are we are proceeding at exactly the right speed. And so, when you have imagine a graph where the y-axis is the number of VR units out there and the x-axis is time. For most people, that timeline, the x-axis, it begins in like 2013. If you pull back and look down, you go back to 1995, what you see is this amazing hockey stick function where it turns out we are accelerating vastly each year, and in my opinion, we're going at just the right rate. You mentioned the Russian man who died because he bled to death due to distraction in VR. We haven't had a case like that in the United States, and part of me is thrilled that we're going at a rate where we can at least it's still pretty quick from my opinion, but it's going slow enough so that we can actually learn some lessons as we're going out there and prevent some of these accidents.
Yeah, and it's funny when you look at a line chart, if you zoom all the way in, it just looks like it's flatlining, but zoom out 20 years and wow, hockey stick growth.
Yeah, when I first started doing this, there was I don't know the exact number in 1999, but my bet is that it was in the hundreds of VR displays out there, not in the thousands. And now there's conservatively, one question I get asked often is how many VR systems are there in the U.S. And the number is depending on how you count. The lowest bound is about 10 million high-end systems in the United States, and so it can obviously be much higher, but that's a pretty good chunk. And I know that the venture capitalists, they want quicker return on investments, but as a citizen, I'm just fine with that rate.
Yeah, and it's funny what you said there. It reminds me of I think it was IBM. One of their senior executives back in the 60s said, "Oh, the world will never need more than say four computers or 4 personal computers or something along those lines." Yeah, it's funny. So, given that, what are some of the key challenges? Obviously, content is one. The cost of the hardware is another. There's behavioral patterns and changes amongst human beings that obviously is another factor. And I mean, what are some of the key challenges that are, I suppose, preventing the uptake? Obviously, you say it's moving at the pace that it should, but are there any key sort of challenges you see getting between VR and mainstream adoption?
I think you hit the nail on the head with your first list, and that was content. And if you would have asked me that question a year ago, I would have said that the roadblock is tracking, meaning you've got to be able to measure someone's physical movement so that you can update the scene appropriately in the goggles. And there's been amazing progress there from Microsoft's use of what's called Inside Out, where using ways that you can map the room without having external cameras. So I'm pretty confident that the tracking hurdle is no longer. I'm also not worried about price. I mean, for the room scale VR, the entire room, you've got the Oculus CV1 and you've got the HTC Vive, and both of those they're around $400 now. That's, you're in the range of video games now. So I'm not worried about cost. The real roadblock is content. And there's just not great stuff to do in VR. And part of that is because, in my opinion, and I'm wrong every day, but in my opinion, video games is not a great use case for VR. Video games economically are awesome right now. People play them for hours and hours at a time. They can have conversations with their friends in the room while they're there. They can eat. VR changes a lot of things in video games. So I think there was an early kind of stumble because a lot of energy was going into using VR for games. And the truth is, games work really well as they are right now. And VR, doesn't really add that much. And we can talk about that. But, the content is a great barrier, and there's two things we need to get over. There's two barriers to great content that we need to focus on. One of them is getting people to be able to create 3D models. So there's a lot of programmers out there, and there's a lot of people that can shoot 3D video. But in order for VR to be great, it's got to be interactive. You got to be able to grab things and do things, and have events that respond to your body movements. And to do that, we need more people making 3D models of objects, of places. So that would be one. The second is, a lot of the early movers in VR, they come from industries where they've got assumptions. So film is one of them, and journalism. And so we have a chapter in the book called Stories in the Round. And the chapter is about why traditional storytelling is very challenging in VR. There's a number of things we could talk about, but the main challenge is that in film, you don't get to look anywhere except where the director tells you, because she controls the camera. Wherever the camera's pointed, that's where you look and you're paying attention. In VR, if somebody's got some really important, we call it a plant in film writing, it's a sidelong glance by a character, or it's somebody reaching into their pocket, that's an important cue, and you need to see that. In VR, you can miss that because you're up looking at the ceiling. And so it's really hard to garner attention in VR so that you can do proper storytelling. And I think that's driven a lot of the reasons why the content we don't have all that much home run content, because we're trying to use an old model of storytelling which doesn't really hold in VR.
And have you seen any companies trying to solve these problems?
Only 1,000 of them. Everybody's working hard. Everyone's working hard. It's
funny. I've come across a couple who are trying to build, say, for lack of a better word, WordPress for content creation, whether that's in the AR realm or the VR realm, just trying to democratize the content creation. I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
I think it needs to happen. I think it needs to happen. There's a number of companies that are trying on the startup side, and then you've got the elephants in the room, the big monsters like Unity, who's really trying to democratize the ability for people to do educational content. And so I think you're seeing more of this happen, and I think it's fantastic.
Yeah, and like anything, I mean, going back through say the 20th century, there's always this case of chicken or egg. I mean, I keep referring to Tesla, but at the moment it's like, well, where are all the charge stations? We're not going to invest in charge stations until there's enough cars on the road. Or you go back to, say, the introduction of scanners and barcodes. Manufacturers didn't want to invest in putting barcodes on their product because they said, well, we're just going to wait for the grocery stores to invest in scanners, otherwise we're going to do it. But eventually things even out and you get that mainstream adoption. So I can imagine over time that will have this content problem resolved.
Right. You've got to have the use case that justifies putting on this goggles, right? I mean, it's not for everything. It's got, why would I put this thing on my head? It's going to mess up my hair. It's going to, put a red line on my face, and I can't see my friends. And, why would I do that? And the answer is because the experience you're going to have is worth it. And not everything's worth it. It's really, I can tell the story of Walmart, what we did with Walmart, which is, so Steve, I've co-founded a company called Striver. Striver uses virtual reality not just to train athletes, but employees. And Walmart had this handbook of how to be an amazing Walmart employee and how to train your employees. We went through it to find scenarios that we thought would be just spectacular and helpful in VR. And, the answer is that, 95% of them didn't need to be in VR. It still leaves a lot of things to be in VR, but there's some things that you read it and that's enough. Other things, for example, holiday rush, people running all over at you, yelling at you, that's really intense, and getting that practice in VR is worth it.
Yeah, and I guess it's easy to fall into the whole if you're a hammer, everything is a nail sort of mindset where, okay, we've got this tool, we just need to use it for everything, when in reality you don't.
I'm the first person to say to you that most things are not meant to be in VR. Save it for the things that truly leverage the fact that you can look around anywhere and you can walk and see things from different angles, and things that would be impossible to do in the real world, or things that would be so expensive you couldn't do them in the real world, or things that are dangerous, for example, like flight simulators and training soldiers.
Couldn't agree more. So we've touched on a few applications. We talked about field trips, talked about building empathy, and just now we talked about some of the work you're doing with Striver with employees. I'm keen to explore what you're doing with athletes around performance.
So this began as a master's thesis in my lab. Derek Belch, who was my former undergraduate student who came back to do his master's with me in 2013, 2014. His thesis was using virtual reality to help train American football players. And he was an assistant coach on the Stanford football team, and we used VR to help athletes make better decisions. We weren't teaching them how to kick or throw or run. They're already pretty good at that. What we were doing is giving them extra mental repetitions where they could look around the field, they could recognize a defensive pattern, and they could make a decision. Do they change a play? Do they keep the original play? Do they have a person move a meter to the left? And it was about giving people extra mental practice. And what Derek demonstrated with his thesis was that the Stanford team outperformed expectations that year. Coach Shaw, who's an investor in the company, so take this with a grain of salt, but Coach Shaw believed that this was one of the tools that helped Stanford do so well that year. Kevin Hogan, who is our quarterback, he says that this is a tool that helped him, have the games of his life and really improve. So, of course, I would never take credit for any of his genius and his talents and his hard work, but it's just another tool that helped him. When Derek graduated in 2015, he formed a company called Striver, and I'm a co-founder of Striver. And Striver used VR to train athletes. What stunned us is that in the first few months, he signed a number of pro teams to multi-year contracts, and since then it's just been a meteoric rise where we're working with the German national football team and the U.S. Olympic ski team and a number of basketball teams and baseball. We don't have any cricket yet, but certainly thinking about it.
Oh, well, just because I'm from Australia doesn't mean I like cricket. I'm more of a soccer fan or football, as we like to say. But yeah, the German national football team, that's awesome stuff. And I guess what you talked about there, I mean, a lot of sports psychologists work with athletes and, they get them to visualize the way the game is going to go, the way the fight is going to pan out and all that sort of stuff. And I guess what you're doing with VR takes some aspects of that visualization, but then embeds the whole decision-making process into it. So you have this sort of immersive visualization so that when that particular situation arises in a game, you've been there before in the virtual world and you're much more likely to respond to it in the most optimal way.
Right. So you need to parse out, you just hit both points. One is decision making. The other is confidence. And so decision making is about simple pattern recognition. Do you see a pattern? Based on that pattern, what should you do? And that's just a repetition, 1,000 hours type learning to get better at seeing the field in a gestalt way and making a decision. But the other area is confidence. And the confidence story, there's a lot of work we're doing with field goal kickers. So in American football, you kick a field goal, and free throw shooters. Free throws in basketball, you stand still and you just have to. And both of these, there's a huge mental aspect to this. And, it's not hard for a pro basketball player to hit a free throw physically, but your mind can get in the way. When you talked about visualization, the problem with visualization is that when you're in a slump, it's hard to visualize success. You actually see yourself failing when you try to succeed in your own mind. VR takes that out of it. And we've got great data with free throw shooters showing when they practice in VR, they shoot better in the actual games, and similar data with field goal kickers.
Right. And so then when they line up to the free throw line in the real world, they're just a lot more confident and their mind doesn't get in the way of nailing the bucket.
They literally, before they come out on the court or the field, they're in the locker room using VR, seeing themselves be perfect. So we film them in 360, and we film until they do about 10 in a row that were just perfect form and hard to do, and it takes a long time sometimes. They then have this personalized reel where they can see themselves from the third person being perfect, and that is a huge boost to their confidence.
Yeah, so currently when we're watching a fighter, get his wraps on, backstage, getting ready for a fight, we see them with their headphones in. I guess maybe in a few years' time, or even now already, where they'll be wearing their headsets and getting their mindset right for the fight.
So for fighters, with people in the that do MMA, for them, when they practice, when they spar, sometimes you can get hurt when you're sparring. If you get punched in the face and your jaw gets broken and you can't be in that match, that's going to cost you a lot of money. So the application there, which is fantastic, which is you can do practice without getting hurt.
That's awesome. We've actually we're actually running a VR AR accelerator program with Microsoft and Village Roadshow at the moment. And one of the startups that's come through is a company called Virtual Fighting Championship, so VFC. And I mean, they started out just modeling, say, a Street Fighter 2 type of game, but you actually being in the game. And they're suggesting that they can take that and apply it to things like, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu or fencing or other sports as a way to not only practice against the computer, but also potentially fight against someone on the other side of the world.
Well, I applaud using training software like that for soldiers and perhaps for professional fighters. My worry is when combat software gets in the hands of all citizens. And so that's where we need to think about, is this really what we want to be doing with VR? And maybe the answer is yes, but I always like to think twice when we think about, my lab has been funded by the U.S. military for throughout my career, and I'm proud to make our soldiers better at their jobs. But do we want to have citizens learning combat skills that have typically been reserved, for professionals and soldiers? And I'm not saying no, and I'm not in favor of regulation. I'm all about free speech. I'm just questioning, in this magic moment where VR is not yet in every living room, let's actually take stock of what we want to do.
Yeah, very wise words. And I mean, sometimes we can open the Pandora's box amidst this sort of veil of excitement and whatnot, but what are the implications? And digressing for a moment, people are talking about artificial superintelligence rather, and once you get past that point, there's no turning back. So what are the implications going to be? And asking questions now, similarly about VR and the different applications, going back to our conversation at the start of the show, is critically important. But I guess worry that financial incentives will get in the way of reason in many cases.
I agree. It's all, that's why we should talk about it, and I appreciate that we are.
Mm-hmm. So one of the other applications I wanted to quickly touch on, Jeremy, was around healthcare. And I've come across companies like MindMaze who are using VR for neurorehabilitation to treat stroke victims, treat people with trauma. I mean, what are you seeing in this space that's exciting?
One of the fun things that I've got to see here at Stanford is that it used to be we were the only VR lab on campus, and we've seen this amazing proliferation of other areas on campus using virtual reality. And in the med school, we've just got a stellar group using VR. So one project that we're currently analyzing data on is called Project Braveheart, and the lead on this is a woman named Dr. Ann Dubin, and she's a pediatric heart surgeon. We built this primer for kids who are going to come in and get heart surgery. It's a virtual reality tour of their hospital. So most kids don't get to really see what's going to happen to them. They get to come to the waiting room first and look around. They get to go to the different room and meet their anesthesiologist. And then at some point they're going to practice their breathing exercises so that they can, feel as if they are calming down, so they can actually then transfer that skill when they're actually in the hospital. And it's a way for them to, have some stress inoculation before they actually get to the hospital. And that's a neat project that I'm excited about.
It's very, very exciting. And finally, Jeremy, on things like cognitive biases. Cognitive biases play a massive role when it comes to creativity and innovation and preventing people from, coming up with some breakthrough idea. Usually they have these, and it's not just innovation and creativity. It is, we're touching on free will, and we've got over 100 cognitive biases that plague our decisions, whether it's confirmation bias and so on. Can VR help us to better understand our biases and therefore, based on that, make better decisions?
So I'm going to take it a step further. I think there's really good programs out there now that can help us understand our biases. So I'm fairly deep in the diversity training space, and most of the services and companies, they will show you that you're biased, and I think that's important. What VR can do is it can teach you how to behave in a way that's inconsistent with bias. It's really hard to change bias, and we're all biased, as you point out. What VR does, it gives you extra mental repetitions. It allows you to, some work we're doing with the National Football League is we built an interview trainer. So imagine you're giving an interview. There's mistakes that everybody makes when you give interviews, and it turns out that people ask different questions, exhibit different nonverbal behavior based on, features like race and gender, and there's bias that exists in interviews. We've built a simulator where you can go through an interview, and we can change how the person who you're interviewing looks. And then you can do it again. And then when you do it again, we can pause. We can say, hey, the first time you did it, you were looking here. You asked this person these types of questions, and this other person, you asked different questions, and there's no real reason why you should have. And you get to basically relive that interview the same way you would do a flight simulator to get better at flying. So the home run for VR is, let's not use it just to show you your bias, but let's actually give you the behavioral training to be better.
Yeah. Yeah, and I know that myself, as a podcast host, depending on the energy of the other person, whether they're male and female, which part of the world they're calling from, what field they're in, it definitely dictates the kinds of questions you ask in some cases that you normally wouldn't. And so what I'm hinting at, Jeremy, is please build a podcast VR application.
Well, I guess I must apologize here for stereotyping you as a cricket fan, and I'm sorry for that.
All good. Jeremy, you've left us with a lot of value bombs, but I can't let you get away without throwing you into our 3-question lightning round. Are you ready to rock and roll?
Yes, sir.
Let's do this. So question number 1 is, if you could work for any organization at any stage of the company life cycle, so we could go back to Apple in the late 70s, who would it be and why?
I would be a roadie for Black Sabbath.
Oh man, you just hit the nail on the head. Which, are we talking Black Sabbath 1? Which era?
Ozzy Sabbath is by far the best music ever made, but I also love Ronnie James Dio, so it's I'd be happy either way.
That's awesome, man. I actually kicking myself to this day because Heaven and Hell played in Melbourne about 7 years ago, just before Dio passed away, and I had other commitments that night, which I didn't think I'll ever get over that one.
I've seen Anthrax play in Australia. I've seen Faith No More play in Australia. There's a lot of good metal out there.
There is a lot of good metal. Cool. So question number 2 is, if you could ask anyone a question, dead or alive, Jeremy, who would it be and what would you ask?
I would probably talk to some of my relatives, and I didn't get to meet my grandparents, but it would have been really neat to meet them.
Definitely. Anything in particular you'd ask them, or?
Just get to see who they are, what they're like.
Awesome. Love it. And lucky last, and I guess I want to circle back to something you said at the very start of the show when you said, you're working in the cognitive science field, it was quite saturated, and you're working 80-hour weeks, and then you made a decision to step away from that, which a lot of people don't do. A lot of people get socially indoctrinated and just believe that, well, this is the way it's supposed to be, and then end up living for the weekend. And so I guess took a good deal of awareness and proactivity to step away from that. And I always ask people what sort of rituals or routines did they have to stay on top of their games. But aside from that, what got you to make that move?
First, when I tell the story, it seems like there was this grand narrative and I made it happen. There was a series of fortunate accidents that I could bore you with all the details. But one tangible answer to your question, when I was in Santa Barbara, I was living in an apartment that was less than 250 square feet. It was tiny. So I was either in the office or I was out in the clubs or I was doing stuff outdoors. But there was no point in being home.
Yeah. Fair enough. Usually from the outside looking in, people are like, man, you're so brave. You just like completely reinvented yourself. But there was probably a hell of a lot of butterfly moments and chance encounters along the way that just made the path present itself. So with that, what rituals or routines do you have to kick ass at what you do, Jeremy?
I'm an insomniac. It helps.
Yep. So you're going to bed at like, 4 a.m. or something like that?
That's when I'm waking up. I get to bed. Try to get bed pretty early.
Awesome. Love it. Okay, Jeremy. Well, people can find out more about you at Jeremy Bailenson. That's Bailenson on Twitter. They can obviously find the book and your previous book both on Amazon, and they can check out your faculty page, which we'll put into the show notes. Is there anywhere else they should go to find out more about you and connect?
That's it. You got it.
Awesome. Any parting words of wisdom for our audience?
I just want to thank you for your thoughtful questions and your due diligence, and you have a great day.
Awesome. You too, Jeremy. Thank you so much.
Cheers.
Hi guys, Steve again. If you're picking up what we're putting down, the team and I would really appreciate it if you took just a minute of your time to like, share, or subscribe, or if you're feeling really generous, do all three on iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, or Google Play. It would mean a lot. If you'd like to join the conversation online, we're building a Facebook community for Future Squared, where you'll be able to connect with fellow listeners as well as my good self to talk about past episodes as well as propose guests and questions for future episodes of the show. You can find the Facebook group over at facebook.com/Future Squared Podcast. I'd love to see you there. Until next time, Future Squared is out.